December 6, 1917. Halifax harbour hummed with the rhythms of war. The city, a vital Atlantic port for the Allied war effort, bustled with ships loading munitions, troops, and supplies bound for the trenches of Europe. Snow dusted the rooftops. The air was sharp with winter's bite. In the narrow channel known as the Narrows, where the Bedford Basin meets the open harbour, two vessels, each on a mission shaped by global conflict, steered toward a collision that would shatter a city and rewrite history. The SS Mont-Blanc, a French cargo steamer, had just arrived from New York. Her hold brimmed with a volatile cargo. 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and 35 tons of benzol, a highly flammable fuel stored in barrels on deck. She flew a red flag, the international signal for dangerous cargo. But few in Halifax knew its meaning. Her captain, Aimé le Medic, sought to enter the Bedford Basin to join a wartime convoy. Meanwhile, the SS Imo A Norwegian relief ship, chartered to carry supplies to war-ravaged Belgium, was departing the basin, running behind schedule. Her pilot, William Hayes, eager to make up time, steered her through the Narrows at an unusual hour. Navigation rules in the harbour were clear. Inbound vessels yielded to outbound ones. But confusion reigned that morning. Miscommunication, haste, and the tight confines of the channel converged. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the Imo, swinging wide to avoid a slow-moving coal barge, veered into the Mont Blanc's path. Le Medec ordered full reverse, but it was too late. The Imo's reinforced bow, designed for ice-breaking, scraped along the Mont Blanc's starboard side, tearing open her hull and igniting sparks that set the benzol barrels ablaze. Fire erupted instantly. A thick, black smoke coiling into the pale winter sky. Panic did not follow at first. To onlookers lining the docks, school children walking to class, workers pausing on their morning commute, the spectacle seemed distant, even curious. No alarm bells rang. No warnings echoed through the streets. In fact, many drew closer, drawn by the drama of flames dancing on water, unaware that they were gathering around a floating bomb. For 20 agonizing minutes, the fire raged unchecked. Firefighters rushed to the scene, among them Chief Officer Billy Wells and his crew from the Halifax Fire Department. They battled the blaze with hoses and courage, not knowing what lay beneath the flames. On the Mont Blanc, the crew had already abandoned ship, rowing desperately for shore, shouting warnings in French that few understood. On the Imo, sailors watched helplessly from a safe distance. In the Richmond district, a working-class neighbourhood of wooden homes, churches, and schools, life continued as usual. Children played in snowdrifts. Shopkeepers swept their steps. And then, at 9:04:35 a.m., the world ended. The explosion that followed was unlike anything humanity had witnessed. The Mont Blanc's cargo detonated with the force of roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. It remains the largest man-made, non-nuclear explosion in history. The blast vaporized the ship instantly, and with it the surrounding water, the seabed, and everything within a half-mile radius. A fireball rose thousands of feet into the air, followed by a shock wave that flattened 2.5 square kilometers of the city's north end. Buildings disintegrated into splinters. Churches collapsed like paper. Tram cars were hurled from their tracks. Windows shattered as far as 100 kilometers away in Truro, in Windsor, even across the bay in Prince Edward Island. And then came the tsunami. A wall of water, triggered by the sudden displacement of the harbour, surged inland at 60 kilometers per hour, sweeping away homes, docks, and people caught in its path. The air itself became a weapon superheated, pressurized, and lethal. Those who looked toward the harbour saw only blinding white light, and then nothing. In the silence that followed, brief, eerie, absolute, the scale of devastation became clear. Nearly 2,000 souls were gone in an instant. Among them, entire families, school children at the Richmond School, firefighters who had run toward the danger. Over 9,000 more were injured, many blinded by flying glass, crushed under rubble, or burned by the heat flash. The dead included Vincent Coleman, a railway dispatcher who, realizing the danger, stayed at his post to send a final telegraph warning an incoming passenger train to stop, saving hundreds at the cost of his own life. His message: hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbour making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Would become a symbol of quiet heroism amid chaos. Halifax, a city of $50,000, was now a landscape of ruin. Fires spread through the wreckage. Survivors wandered dazed through snow and smoke, calling out names that would never be answered. Hospitals overflowed within minutes. Doctors operated by lamplight on kitchen tables. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. The cold deepened. Night fell on a city without power, without water, without hope. Yet from the ashes rose an extraordinary response. Within hours, relief trains began rolling in from Boston, from Montreal, from across Canada and the United States. The Massachusetts Public Safety Committee dispatched a relief train carrying doctors, nurses, medical supplies, food, and blankets, arriving less than 24 hours after the blast. Boston's aid was so swift, so generous, that Halifax would forever after send a Christmas tree to the city as a token of gratitude, a tradition that continues to this day. The disaster also exposed profound failures and sparked profound reforms. A formal inquiry, led by Justice Arthur Drysdale, placed primary blame on the Mont-Blanc's captain and pilot. But public outrage demanded more than scapegoats. Why had no one warned the public? Why were dangerous cargoes allowed to linger in a crowded harbour? Why were safety protocols so lax in a city central to the war machine? The answers led to sweeping changes. Canada established the first National Disaster Relief Protocol. Maritime laws were overhauled globally. Ships carrying explosives were required to fly clear warning signals, follow designated routes, and avoid congested ports during daylight hours. The Halifax Relief Commission was formed, one of the first coordinated civilian disaster agencies in the world overseeing medical care, housing reconstruction, and financial aid for survivors. It pioneered concepts of trauma counselling and long-term rehabilitation, though the language of psychological injury was still decades from common use. But beyond policy, the explosion left a moral reckoning. In the rush to support the war effort, had safety been sacrificed for speed? Had bureaucracy blinded officials to risk? And what of the children's, over 1,500 lost their parents, now orphans, in a shattered city? The ethical weight of the disaster lay not just in the collision of two ships, but in the collision of duty, haste, and human fallibility. Rebuilding began almost immediately. Entire neighbourhoods were redesigned with wider streets, fire-resistant materials, and modern infrastructure. The Hydrostone District Halifax's first planned community rose from the rubble, a testament to resilience. Yet scars remained. Survivors spoke of the blindness epidemic that followed, as thousands suffered eye injuries from shattered glass. Many carried shrapnel in their bodies for life. And every December 6th, the city would fall silent at 9:04 a.m., a moment of remembrance etched into its soul. The Halifax explosion did not just destroy a city, It transformed it. It revealed both the fragility of civilization and its capacity for compassion. In the face of unimaginable loss, strangers became caregivers, enemies became allies, and a port shaped by war became a beacon of humanitarian response. The blast that shook the earth also shook the conscience of a nation and the world. In the months that followed, the work of healing unfolded not only in hospitals and rubble-strewn streets, but in courtrooms and committee rooms, where the search for accountability intertwined with the urgent need for recovery. The Wreck Commissioner's inquiry, convened just days after the disaster, heard testimony from pilots, harbour officials, naval officers and survivors. Captain Lemedec of the Mont-Blanc and pilot Francis Mackey, who had been at the helm during the collision, were initially charged with manslaughter and criminal negligence. So too was pilot William Hayes of the IMO. Yet as evidence mounted, it became clear that the tragedy was not born of malice, but of a cascade of small errors, misjudgments, and systemic gaps. The inquiry's final report, issued in the spring of 1918, assigned shared responsibility. It criticised the Mont Blanc for entering the harbour without sufficient warning, the IMO for violating navigation rules, and harbour authorities for failing to enforce safety protocols or alert the public once the fire began. Ultimately, the charges against the individuals were dropped, the courts recognising that while human error played a role, the true failure lay in the absence of clear, enforceable standards for handling wartime explosives in civilian spaces. This legal reckoning, though imperfect, laid groundwork for international maritime reform. In 1918, the Canadian government enacted the Explosives Act, tightening controls on the transport and storage of hazardous materials. The United States and European nations soon followed with similar measures. The International Maritime Organization would later cite Halifax as a pivotal case in developing global protocols for dangerous cargo rules that remain in effect today, ensuring that no ship laden with high explosives would ever again drift unnoticed through a crowded harbour. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Halifax Relief Commission became a model of coordinated disaster response. Funded by federal grants, private donations, including over $750,000 from the Boston Relief Committee, equivalent to more than $15 million today, and public fundraising efforts, the Commission provided medical care, prosthetics, housing, and education for thousands. It established the first public health nursing program in Nova Scotia and pioneered vocational training for those left disabled by the blast. For orphans, it created the Halifax Orphanage and later supported adoptions and foster placements, though many children were sent to institutions far from home. A practice now viewed with regret, but reflective of the era's limited understanding of trauma and family preservation. Among the most haunting legacies was the impact on the Mi'kmaq community of Tufts Cove, located just east of the blast zone. Though often overlooked in early accounts, Indigenous families suffered losses too, homes destroyed, livelihoods disrupted, and aid slow to reach them due to systemic marginalisation. Their stories, long absent from official narratives, have since been reclaimed by historians and community elders, adding depth and nuance to the collective memory of the disaster. As winter turned to spring in 1918, Halifax began to breathe again. Streetcars resumed service, schools reopened in temporary buildings, new homes rose where entire blocks had vanished. Yet the psychological toll lingered. Survivors spoke of flinching at the sound of a slammed door, of nightmares filled with fire and silence. The term shell shock, then used to describe soldiers' trauma from the Western Front, found a civilian echo in Halifax, though few had the language to name it. Doctors noted a surge in anxiety, insomnia, and what we now recognise as post-traumatic stress, particularly among children who had lost parents or witnessed unspeakable scenes. The city's physical reconstruction was swift, but its emotional recovery spanned generations. Memorials began to appear. A simple stone cairn at Fort Needham Park, where citizens had gathered to watch the burning ship. Plaques in churches listing the dead. The poignant Maryland statue in the Halifax Public Gardens. A weeping woman cradling a child, erected by the Massachusetts Halifax Relief Fund. These were not just tributes to the lost, but anchors for the living away to hold grief without being consumed by it. Internationally, Halifax became a case study in urban disaster response. Urban planners studied its rebuilding efforts. Medical journals documented its triage innovations. And in Boston, the bond forged in crisis endured. When the Spanish flu pandemic struck later in 1918, Halifax sent nurses and supplies back to its benefactor a quiet reciprocity that cemented a transnational friendship. To this day, the annual Christmas tree sent from Nova Scotia to Boston stands lit on the Boston Common, a living symbol of gratitude that draws thousands each year. Yet the explosion's greatest legacy may be its warning one, whispered in every safety drill, every harbour regulation, every emergency broadcast system. It taught the world that in an age of industrial-scale warfare and global trade, a single spark in the wrong place could unravel a city. And that preparedness, transparency, and public trust are not luxuries, but necessities. More than a century later, the Halifax explosion remains etched in Canada's national consciousness, not as a footnote to the Great War, but as a defining moment of civic trauma and renewal. Historians note that while the war raged overseas, Halifax endured its own front line, not with trenches and artillery, but with fire, water, and silence. And from that silence emerged voices of survivors, rescuers, reformers, who insisted that such a catastrophe must never happen again. In classrooms across Nova Scotia, children still learn the story. They visit the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, where fragments of the Mont-Blanc rest beside a child's charred shoe and a clock stopped at 9:04. They stand at the Halifax Explosion Memorial Bell Tower, where the carillon rings each December 6th. And they are taught not only what happened, but why it matters. Because the Halifax explosion was more than a collision of ships. It was a collision of fate and negligence, of courage and chaos, of destruction and solidarity. It revealed how quickly normalcy can vanish, and how stubbornly humanity clings to hope. In the end, the city did not just rebuild its buildings, it rebuilt its belief in itself, and in doing so, offered the world a blueprint for rising from ruin, with eyes wide open. The echoes of that December morning rippled far beyond Halifax's harbour walls, influencing not only maritime law and emergency response, but also the very architecture of modern urban safety. In the years following the explosion, cities across North America and Europe began rethinking how they managed industrial hazards within densely populated areas. Zoning laws evolved to separate residential neighbourhoods from high-risk facilities. Fire departments adopted new protocols for handling chemical fires, emphasising evacuation over direct confrontation when volatile materials were involved. And perhaps most significantly, the concept of a centralised emergency command structure, coordinating police, fire, medical, and military resources under unified leadership gained traction, directly inspired by the chaotic first hours in Halifax when well-meaning responders worked at cross purposes. This institutional learning was not immediate, nor was it universal, but Halifax became a reference point, a cautionary tale invoked in boardrooms and legislative chambers whenever expediency threatened to override caution. During World War II, when Allied ports again brimmed with munitions-laden vessels, Planners explicitly cited the 1917 disaster as justification for strict convoy procedures, segregated anchorage zones, and mandatory public alert systems. Even the Manhattan Project, racing to develop the atomic bomb, studied Halifax as a benchmark for blast effects. Its crater depth, pressure wave radius, and casualty patterns feeding into early nuclear yield models. Yet for all its global impact, the heart of the story remained local. In the Richmond district, where nearly every structure had been erased, families returned to plots marked only by chimneys or cellar holes. Some chose not to rebuild at all, relocating to other parts of the city, carrying their grief like invisible luggage. Others stayed, planting gardens where schools once stood, hanging photographs salvaged from the wreckage on new walls. The community's resilience was neither loud nor theatrical. It was in the quiet persistence of daily life returning. A baker reopening his shop, a teacher holding class in a church basement, neighbours sharing coal during another harsh winter. Among those who embodied this quiet endurance was Barbara Orr, a young girl who lost her entire family in the blast. Rescued from the rubble by a neighbour, she was raised by relatives and later became a nurse, dedicating her life to caring for others. Her story, like so many, was rarely told in headlines, but it lived in the fabric of the city. Similarly, Vince Coleman's sacrifice, though initially overlooked in official reports, grew into legend through oral history, eventually earning him posthumous honours and a place in Canada's pantheon of civilian heroes. The media of the time played a dual role, both documenting and shaping the narrative. Newspapers like the Halifax Herald published lists of the dead and missing, turning private anguish into public record. Photographers, such as W.G. McLaughlin, captured haunting images of flattened streets and dazed survivors, images that galvanized international aid, but also at times exploited trauma for dramatic effect. These early visual records became crucial not only for historical preservation, but for legal and scientific analysis, helping engineers reconstruct the blast dynamics and aiding relief workers in identifying neighbourhoods most in need. Importantly, the disaster also exposed stark inequalities in who received help and who was forgotten. While white, middle-class families often found swift rehousing and financial support, Black Haligonians in communities like Africville and working-class immigrants faced longer waits, fewer resources, and greater skepticism from relief officials. This disparity, though rarely acknowledged in 1917, has since been examined by historians as part of a broader pattern of systemic bias in disaster response, a lesson that remains painfully relevant today. Still, amid the inequities, there were moments of profound unity. On the night of the explosion, with temperatures plunging and fires spreading, strangers opened their homes to the injured regardless of background. Doctors from rival hospitals collaborated without regard for institutional pride. Sailors from the Royal Canadian Navy and the US Navy worked side by side in the snow, pulling survivors from collapsed buildings. In those raw, unscripted hours, the divisions of class, nationality, and creed dissolved. Not because they didn't exist, but because survival demanded something more urgent: shared humanity. As the war ended in November 1918, Halifax stood as both a wounded city and a symbol of what collective action could achieve. The Relief Commission, initially expected to operate for months, remained active for over a decade, finally winding down in 1976. Its final act, the transfer of remaining funds to support elderly survivors. By then, the last children orphaned by the blast had long since grown old themselves, their memories preserved in letters, diaries, and recorded interviews that now reside in archives across Canada. Today, the site of the explosion is marked not by ruin, but by renewal. the Halifax shipyard thrives. The Narrows bustle with container ships and ferries. Children play in parks where once there was only ash. Yet beneath the surface of modern life, the past pulses quietly. Geologists note that the seabed still bears a slight depression where the Mont-Blanc vaporized. Historians point out that many street layouts in the North End follow the post-explosion grid city literally rebuilt on new foundations. And every year, on the anniversary, the bells of St. Paul's Church, whose stained glass window was blown out but never replaced, left as a memorial ring out over the harbour. The Halifax explosion teaches us that disasters are not merely events, they are turning points. They reveal the fragility of systems we assume are solid, the courage we didn't know we possessed, and the connections that hold us together when everything else falls apart. It reminds us that safety is not passive. It must be designed, debated, and defended. And it shows that even in the darkest moment, when the sky turns white and the earth shakes, the human instinct is not to flee, but to reach out. In honouring those lost on December 6, 1917, we do more than remember names. We reaffirm a covenant that knowledge gained through tragedy must never be forgotten, and that the price paid in Halifax must continue to protect others across oceans and generations. For as long as ships carry dangerous cargo, as long as cities press close to industrial corridors, as long as the unexpected remains possible, the lessons of that winter morning endure, not as a warning from the past, but as a compass for the future.